We are live.
We are live. Hello. We are live, yes. Just confirming.
It says we are live. I'm just waiting for the pictures to show up on the YouTube channel.
Yes, I think there was just a bit of a delay happening there. Live streaming woes, unfortunately. Hello, everybody. We are definitely live now because I can see the images.
There. Live streaming woes, unfortunately. Hello, everybody.
An example of this is the corner we use on E2M6 to warp into.
So what on earth is that noise?
So this is the fun bit about live recordings is everything that can go wrong will go wrong. So here we are. I do know we have people watching us, so I apologies for the kind of stumble at the beginning. These things happen live, as you all know. But yes, hello, we are the Product Dynamic, and welcome to this session. We are going to be talking about cognitive biases with Saeed Khan. Now, before we get started, just a quick run through of how this is going to work. We will let Saeed start his presentation, and we'll have a little discussion and Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions as we're going through things, drop it in the chats, and Jason will flash it on screen, either as we go or at the end during the Q&A. So this is definitely being recorded. You can always watch it back if you have to drop off at any time. So don't worry about that. And with that, we can get started.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Jason. I'm going to talk about cognitive bias and breaking cognitive bias in product, sort of really focusing on product-related issues. I don't know if people know who I am. Maybe it might help to know a little bit about me. I've worked in product for a long time, since the last millennium, as I tell people, but about 24 years. I now consult with product companies, helping them build better products and better product teams. I've been writing for a long time on product. Most of my recent work is on Medium, and I work with companies in sort of a lot of different areas, different verticals. So if you need help in product, give me a call. I wanted to start a bit before getting into cognitive bias. I want to start a bit by looking at a couple of pictures, and this is one. When you look at it, what do you see? It looks like a boat floating in air. It's basically a very basic optical illusion. The boat obviously isn't floating in the air. But it goes to the point of perception and how we see the world and how we interpret information that we get. And our brains are complex machines. We don't really understand them, but we understand aspects of them. So, once you look at this picture and you see the boat and you kind of get over the sort of cognitive dissonance of why is that boat floating, you realize, oh yeah, it's actually not floating in air, it's floating in water, and the sun and the light and so on are affecting what you see and how you understand it, right? So that's one optical illusion. And then there's this famous one, which I don't really think was an optical illusion, but hopefully what you see here are three dresses. One is blue and black, one is sort of a lighter shade of blue and black, and the third one has, or not even blue and black, maybe a little bit of gold and white and blue, and then the third one is, mostly white and gold. This was the famous, dress illusion, if you want to call it that, from a couple of years back. And what you see depended on the lighting in the room and the condition of your eyes and how you were interpreting it. And I remember when this was very popular, I had it on my screen. I went and all day I looked at it and it was white and gold. And then I was working, and then I went out for a short walk, and then I came back and it was literally the same image in the same window, and it was blue and black. And I couldn't figure out how it had changed so drastically. And I called my kids in, and half the kids saw the blue and black, and half the kids saw the white and gold. So again, it's a matter of information and perception and how we understand things. So neither of these are logical fallacies. Sorry, neither of these are cognitive biases, but they are kind of a background to say, okay, we can all be looking at the same information. We can all be, thinking about something, but we can perceive it very differently. So I want to get into cognitive bias. And you know, the cognitive bias, we don't learn about these things in school. There's not like a course that you take and they talk about decision making and things like that. I've never sort of studied this formally in university. Perhaps it's discussed in university. But a cognitive bias is basically a systemic error in thinking, right, that occurs when you're processing information and it affects your decisions and judgment, right? So there's three parts there. So first of all, systemic, and that's really important to understand. It's not just some random thing. It's not like that illusion or that dress where, you know, you kind of look at it once and it looks one thing and then another. You're not controlling what you're seeing so much as you're trying to process that. So this is something systemic that happens. You're processing, interpreting information, and the reality is it's really about the decisions you make and how you actually take that information or whatever and work with it. So, you know, you've got the problem, the systemic error, you've got the action, which is the processing, interpreting information, and then you've got the outcome, right? The decisions that you make. And you can break it down in that way that, you know, when you see make some decision based on some information, if it's systemic, there's probably some bias involved in it, maybe a cognitive bias. So I just want to give another definition just to kind of distinguish something that's similar to a cognitive bias, which is a logical fallacy, right? So a logical fallacy is based on an error in a logical argument. It's something that, you know, you come to a conclusion that may be incorrect or may be wrong, but it's based on how you thought through some process, right? Whereas a cognitive bias is rooted in real processing errors, like often subconscious. You don't really understand what happened, but you come to a conclusion based on factors that may or may not be under your control, right? So, I mean, you can think of a logical fallacy as it's specific and local to a particular situation or an argument that you're trying to make, versus the bias, which, as we talked about, is more systemic. I think of cognitive biases as sort of global. A cognitive bias could impact, you know, your logical argument, so they could be related in that way. But I look at cognitive biases as something greater. And the reality is we're all impacted by cognitive biases. None of us is immune. It's something that's just part of our intrinsic thought process, but it's something we can change. It's something we can, if we understand what it is, we can make changes to it. So there's lots of different types of cognitive biases, and they can be classified based on different factors. I like to think of them in just this form of two big buckets, right? So there's cognitive biases that affect us as individuals, and there's cognitive biases that affect groups, right? So confirmation bias is probably the most common cognitive bias. We're all guilty of it. I'm absolutely 100% guilty of it multiple times. It's happened to me. I can think back. You know, you can go, yeah, that makes sense. And then you don't really think through, you know, why you agreed with that or why your conclusion came out that way. Whereas groupthink is probably the most common example, obviously, from the name of a group cognitive bias, but there's many other ones. I'll talk about a couple of them. And not to say that groups cannot suffer from, say, confirmation bias, but confirmation bias, you can think of it as individuals, and then that might feed up into a group, versus groupthink is something that happens only in a group. You can't have groupthink as an individual, right? Obviously. So it's just interesting to think about them that way, and that these things can stack on each other. So individual cognitive biases can lead to a group cognitive bias. So I want to go through a few of these. There's a lot of them that exist. If you go to the Wikipedia page, you'll be shocked at how many. I won't go through as many as are on Wikipedia, but I do want to go through a bunch that are, you know, relatively common and relatively prevalent in the product world, in the sense that you'll encounter them. But before I get into them, I just want to show this, right? This diagram. You've all seen or heard of a version of this diagram. It's sort of the blind man and the elephant, and each one is kind of getting a bit of information, and then they're making conclusions based on that information. On one level, this could be viewed as a cognitive bias. Hopefully the guy who looks at it and says, hey, it's a wall, doesn't climb down the ladder and then grab the leg and go, well, it's still part of a wall. That would probably be a cognitive bias. If he says, oh, it's a tree or it's a log or something, that'd be different. But this idea of lack of information or missing information factors into many cognitive biases. So, excuse me, the first one, confirmation bias. Literally, I would say the most common one. It affects us in business, affects us personally, affects us as a society, right? It's the tendency to recognize and remember and associate data and information that confirms our beliefs or views, right? So, and on the flip side, we may also ignore or undervalue information that does not confirm our views. So just interacting with people in politics, you see it all the time. Political beliefs are rooted a lot in confirmation bias. I agree with the party that I always vote for, or, racism, quite honestly, has a big, root in confirmation bias. People have limited ability or limited knowledge about other people, and that's the basis of their views of those people. And then when they see an action by somebody that confirms their view, yeah. Although when they see a counterexample, they don't really use that in their judgment. So confirmation bias exists everywhere. I'll guarantee that 100% of the population of the planet has been affected by it in some way. But it comes up all the time. It comes up in product, and I'll talk about that. Another one that's similar to that is recency bias, right? Tendency to favor recent events over previous ones in terms of value or basis of decision. So we, again, throughout our lives in investment, oh, look, this stock has gone up recently. It's probably a good stock, as opposed to looking at, more historical data, right? When we're in meetings, you hear it all the time, we're talking about something, somebody says something else. Oh yeah, that thing now will divert our discussion. New evidence tends to be used to outweigh older evidence in cases. The last 3 customers you spoke to seem to have more of an influence than the previous 6 you spoke to sometimes. But this idea of fresher data is better is sort of the fundamental point there. Anchoring bias, which is somewhat related, although it's a really different sort of bias, in the sense that we tend to be influenced more by the first piece of information we get about something new and use it as a baseline for comparison. So pricing models are based this way. Often if you hear a commercial, they say, they'll do the ad and they say, we're not going to charge you $100. We're not even going to charge you $80, et cetera, right? Like anchoring is used in pricing in many ways. It's used when we evaluate things. The first thing we evaluate, we use that as kind of the baseline, and everything else is better or worse than that. Often the first customer you talk to, you're like, oh, wow, these are great insights. Then you compare other customer conversations back to that one. Oh, this was better than that one, or this was worse than that one. It's something that happens fairly often. Authority bias is one that I'm sure all of us have had, particularly in product. It's again the tendency to attribute greater value or accuracy or meaning to opinions of people with the opinions of well-known people or people in positions of authority, right? I mean, this is where you get the whole influencer and celebrity culture, celebrity endorsements. I mean, George Foreman, for those of you who remember, endorsed a grill, the George Foreman grill, and it became wildly popular. He made a huge amount of money based on it, but what is it about George Foreman, ex-boxer, and a grill that somehow, made it very, very popular to buy, right? Political leaders, obviously, and executives, right, in companies, are our boss or the CEO, et cetera. We tend to attribute what they say with more meaning, even in spite of the fact that they have authority over us. People listen to Jeff Bezos for what he says, or Steve Jobs, even though he's dead, has huge influence on the product culture that we live in. Just a couple more. Bandwagon Effect. This is a group kind of cognitive bias, right? It tends to go along with a belief or an activity if others are doing the same thing, right? So the term herd mentality comes in. And again, we see this everywhere in society, in politics. Unfortunately, it has an effect in meetings when there's a debate and then the meeting sort of skews to one side of an argument, and then other people, maybe they don't want to fight the crowd, but they are going to probably move towards where the crowd is, right? So this bandwagon effect is something that can lead to bad decisions, right? Because you're basing a decision probably more on groupthink, for lack of a term, right? It's related. And then the last one, and you can't have a product presentation without a Dilbert cartoon, but this is one that actually came up recently in a discussion, and it's one that I think product managers in particular are impacted by. And I don't like the name of it, to be perfectly honest. Curse of knowledge. It sounds like an affliction, but it's something that we need to be really need to be conscious of, because product management is at the nexus of so many things that are happening in the company, and we have just by the nature of the role, the cross-functional nature, we have access to information, more information than other groups have, and we need it. We need it to do our jobs. But then it's often the case that there's the tendency to think that other people have that same information. And just as a little bit of a backstory, I worked as a product manager for 20 years. I was at that nexus of all that information, and then when we'd roll out products or so on, I would convey that information out as much as I could and to the people who need it. Now I work as a consultant, and I go into companies, and I'm coming in honestly very, very naive about the details. I'm not working inside the company. I don't know all the details, and I see it from the other side, and I wonder how those other groups outside of product are functioning the way they do, because they don't have sales, marketing, et cetera. They don't have all that deep product knowledge, that deep customer knowledge. And so it's something that product people really need to watch out for. And it can be a blind spot as well, that, assuming other people know what you do and then making decisions and that impact them, and they don't understand why. They don't understand the context. They don't understand the background. They don't understand the details that product teams have. And it's true when you're writing. It's true when you're speaking. It's true in any context. And I like this one panel from the cartoon. Sometimes one person's inability to understand looks like another person's inability to explain, which I think perfectly sums up, the problem here with this curse of knowledge. And actually, one more, just before you get too bored of these things. And this one I really like, because it's slightly different from all the others. It is a group cognitive bias, but there's an observed aspect to it, right? So the Hawthorne Effect, if you're not familiar with it, was named after actually not a person, but a place in New York, Hawthorne. And there was some study that was going on at a company, and I don't remember the details. But the people who are being studied were told, hey, this is going to happen. And, on a certain day, somebody's going to come in to observe. And what was actually observed by certain people was that the people who were told this then changed their behavior. It was in a factory, and how they worked and what they did. And so, the idea is that when no one is watching, people will behave a certain way. When they know they're being watched, then they'll behave differently. And it's really important to understand that, because it's not like people are going to just continue doing what they're doing. They'll dress better if they know they're being observed. They'll act more in a more structured way, etc. I don't know if you're familiar with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in physics. I have an undergraduate degree in physics, so I understand it. But I kind of think of it as the Heisenberg uncertainty principle for people, right? So in physics, what it means is that when you observe something at the subatomic level, your observation impacts the situation that you're actually observing. So you can't know everything about the situation, because that observation changed the situation. And I think that applies really well to here, that telling people they're being observed impacts what they'll do and what you will observe. in their behavior. Okay, so that's it. I was going to explain all of these other ones, but I thought you might get bored, so I won't. But there's a great link on this page at venturecapitalist.com, and they have this really great infographic, and they go into detail on this, and you can find lots of information on cognitive biases on the web. But yeah, there's a lot of them. There's several of them that when you read about them, you might go, oh, that happened to us, or I've seen that in effect. So I won't get into them very more. So the question is now, how does this impact product teams, right? And hopefully some of these might have been pretty obvious based on the explanations. I just want to go back to the definition again, just to kind of refresh, right? The systematic error, processing information, and then decision and judgments, right? And if we think about that, and then we think about the product development lifecycle, right? So some form of this, some process where you have strategy and road mapping and discovery and planning and development and launch and then post-launch activities and possibly other things in between. The real question is, in this process, and product teams work throughout this process, product managers work throughout this process, right? When are we making decisions and who is making them and based on what information, right? And the reality is that we're always making decisions. We're constantly making decisions. We're making decisions of focus. We're making decisions on priority. We're making decisions on importance, right? We're doing this constantly, regardless of what's happening. And certainly in the earlier stages, those decisions have much higher impact, right? What you do post-launch is important. And there's certainly feedback loops you can send back, and there's activities you can do. But in those first three stages, particularly, how you look at strategy, how you think of strategy and road mapping together, where you focus your discovery, and then how you plan and prioritize, that's where decisions have the greatest impact on everything downstream. And so it's really important to understand that the decisions you make there should be, as much as possible, independent or free from these biases, right? So as an example, in strategy and road mapping, authority bias plays a big role. When you present a roadmap to executives and you hear the questions or the issues that come up, they're coming in with their preconceived notions, not that they're bad or anything, but they have a certain point of view and a certain perspective. And they're going to impart that and influence the strategy and the roadmap that you may have laid out. And you don't know what their context is. They may not know what your context is. So you can get into these problems, but authority bias certainly plays a role there. Discovery, without question, confirmation bias and anchoring bias come in. I talked about that earlier, but there are other biases that may play in, recency bias or other things. I was doing a project and we were doing discovery work and we're doing customer interviews and they were going okay. There wasn't any problem, but we weren't getting kind of the rich feedback that we wanted. And one of the questions came up was, well, someone said, well, it's either the people we're talking to or the questions we're asking. And they were adamant about this. Like, well, you're either asking the wrong questions or you're not talking to the right people. And like, well, obviously we're talking to people we can talk to and we're asking the questions we believe are the right questions. We can't force people to give us insights or to give us really juicy details. But the reality was we weren't going to get the rich insights without a larger group of interviewees, right? And extending out who we're going to talk to. So it wasn't just that simple, but yet this person was really fixated on the right people, the right questions. It's very cut and dry to them. And anyone who's done kind of really good qualitative discovery work knows that the last thing that work is really cut and dry. You can't package it up. It's really kind of takes effort and time and resources to do. And then, when you're in product planning, there's other biases. And these are two I didn't mention earlier, automation bias and IKEA effect. Automation bias is really a view that things that are automated have more value than things are not automated. The IKEA effect is something that talks about things that we build or assemble ourselves. We have more attachment or value to them. than things that we don't. And so, like, if you've ever been in a company and talking about product planning, and certainly engineers would rather build something than get it from somewhere else. You know, the build versus buy mindset. You know, or not built here is a bias I've seen in companies. And then similarly, IKEA Effect, things we have a hand in creating, we actually have put more value into. So again, not that these are the sum of all the biases, but they all come into decision making in these early stages, and it's important to really focus on removing them as much as possible. You know, I've never seen a case where one of these biases overwhelm the process, but it's sort of like death by 1,000 cuts. Each of them has an impact. Often it's negative, and when you add it up over time, it actually has a material effect on what you're doing. So the question is, how do we minimize these impacts, right? And the first thing is learn about them. So I put this up in particular. So this is that page, the visual capitalist. I put the URL, but I put the QR code just in case. They have a wonderful graphic on their page. And I just thought if you really want to get a quick hit of some cognitive bias information, you can go here. So the real issue is learn about them. Like, just reading about all of these on their own is really informative and enlightening, because, as I said, you'll read them and go, oh, that happened and that happened. You didn't know that it was a formal name for that situation or that problem. And many of them you might look and go, yeah, I've experienced that myself, or I've been guilty of that. So how do we minimize impact? So I think work consciously and systematically remove them where possible. So learn about them, right? So knowing is half the battle. And then take an active role. Think about it from a very active sort of process perspective. Since they're systemic to begin with, think about systemically how to remove them, right? So one thing you can do is, you know, discuss them in retrospectives with your team, right? Talk about them, learn about them together, and then talk about them together, right? You might want to share experiences with executives or other teams of when biases had impacts on decisions, right? And, you know, it may take a little courage sometimes to start that conversation, but I think it's good. Like, once you talk about cognitive biases in a more open, structured way, that'll help other people understand them, right? Like, they might not realize, oh, this decision was made, and we actually had, you know, some recency bias because we had talked to 3 big customers, and then we used that, and that was actually the wrong decision because in the end it wasn't a good decision for the majority of our customers, right? And then, you know, build an open, honest culture as much as possible, and then make it safe to ask if cognitive biases are influencing decisions, right? And I bolded this one because it's this idea of having a safe space to talk and you know, make it something like, you know, if you have authority bias happening, if you've got an executive or an executive team who are really making these sort of maybe they're not doing it consciously, but these unconscious impacts on decisions, you want to have a safe space to be able to raise that and talk about it. And some companies have that, some companies don't, but, you know, start building that culture out if you can. In road mapping, this is one where I've seen, and I've been guilty of it, you know, it has a huge impact, right? So start with an agreed upon a set of business objectives that form the foundation of your work, right? And this is something that you don't see a lot in companies, where when they talk about road mapping, they really get into what to do, right? As opposed to why are we doing things? The business objectives are the why. We want to achieve certain goals. We want to have clarity on the activities that will drive us to reach these goals, right? These objectives have to form the foundation of that work. And if you're building a roadmap without starting with objectives, you're going to have a really bad roadmap. I'll guarantee you. It'll look great. You can create great spreadsheets and use tools or whatever you use. But how do you know the efforts are going in the right direction to the right places, right? So start with objectives, have a structured process to follow that avoids the hippo influence, right? I'll talk about these 4 animals in a sec. And make sure your decisions are traceable, right? Oftentimes decisions are made, but they're not made in a way that you can trace them back to the why, right? So these four animals, if you haven't heard of them, represent four stereotypes or archetypes. Hippo, highest paid person's opinion. Wolf, working on the latest fire, so someone who focuses on the urgent. The rhino, really hear name only, so someone who will contribute their opinion, but maybe won't contribute effort. And then the zebra, zero evidence, but really arrogant, right? So people who have opinions, but don't have any data or anything to support that. These are all people who are part of most companies in some way. You might have met some of them before, and they will have an impact. And people love to have an impact on roadmap. You know, they're not concerned about the details, but at the high level. So understand who these kind of people are, where their decisions are coming from, and then find a different approach based on some, you know, clear business objectives, and then make the decisions traceable. So then you can remove these various biases, right? So that's one approach I take. And I'm going to put this up, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this is a framework that I use to say, yeah, this is how we are going to think about roadmap and strategy and objectives and the context they fit in. And then, you know, product plans are at the bottom. It's the last thing you want to get to. Oftentimes we want to start at the bottom. What should we build? What do we need to build? Now start at the top and align what you're doing and drive down. So that's something to think about. In discovery, don't just validate, right? Often we want to validate something, but really investigate it, right? Create hypotheses, but also discuss the negative. Like, don't just look for affirmation for, hey, this is what we believe, let's go investigate it. Think about the opposite, or think about other situations, right? So have that open discussion, open up beyond the pure focus of what you're trying to learn about. When you're doing discovery and interviews, ask open-ended and neutral questions, right? This is a real skill, to be quite honest, and it takes time to learn. But you know, often people ask loaded questions, right? Like, do you enjoy using the product, or what do you like best about the product, or even what do you like least? You know, those are very subjective, right? You know, how often do you use a feature or something like that? Like, these are all very loaded questions, and trying to avoid them, right? Or even poorly structured questions, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how easy was it to use a feature or do something? Like, what does that mean? Everyone's going to answer it differently. A 3 to one person is a 5 to another, depending on the context, how much they've used it, what their need was, what their goals were, etc. So it's always better to ask questions not about your product, but ask questions about them. What are they doing? What are their goals? What are their objectives? You know, what are their roadblocks and issues and things like that? And then use that as a basis to work backwards into what you're doing. And again, you know, getting rid of confirmation bias, getting rid of some of these other subjective biases. These are ways to do that, right? And then lastly, you know, whenever you're making important decisions, right? Like really, as a group, as a team, or even as an individual, if you're making them, really try and assess, are you being impacted by any of these biases? And I'll tell you a story just to finish this off. Years ago, this is a long time ago, I worked on a product. It was a data profiling product, which basically analyzed data and gave metrics about various aspects of the data. And generally it was used by people at the start of a data project to understand the data they're going to use. And then one of our customers said, hey, you know what? I have this problem when we load data into, it was in this case a data warehouse, we need to make sure that the data was loaded correctly. And, you know, could we use your data profiling product? And I was like, yeah, sure, absolutely. You know, use the product. It does what it does, and you know, you can use it. And really, what it turned out was the answer was no, because their need was actually very different. They weren't trying to learn about the data; they were trying to verify that the data was correct, which is actually a different problem. And what happened was, I just, you know, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So, you know, the confirmation bias in my mind was like, yeah, it's the same scenario. It's the same, you know, kind of problem. Absolutely use it. What happened was a few years later at a CAB meeting, customer advisory board meeting, customer brought up this problem, and they said there's a really important problem and that our company wasn't addressing it. And it wasn't until then that I realized, oh yeah, we actually aren't addressing it because it was not the same problem. And in fact, what happened was we created a new product and a new set of tools for customers to solve the problem. But the point of it is those decisions that were made, that I made, and it wasn't a set flip decision with that customer. It was how I thought about the product, how I thought about the roadmap and the future of that product. Really were focused in one very narrow area, and I didn't see a bigger market opportunity that I could actually expand into or create a new product for. And so this idea of biases, they're there all the time. We know what we know. We look for confirmation. We look for, places where we can take our knowledge and reapply it, as opposed to bringing new knowledge in and really understanding it. So, that's one that I always go back to as an error I made. I could have created a new product years before the company actually created it. And then who knows what would happen. So I'll stop there. Hopefully this has been helpful. And if there's any questions, I'll absolutely take them now.
Saeed? Oh, there you go. No, that's really interesting. We do have one question, which I will show straight away, from Laura Lopez. Can you give an example of a negative hypothesis?
Well, not off the top of my head, but I can think of one. Well, think of it this way. If you have a hypothesis that we believe that, and whatever you believe, and that's the thing you want to go investigate, have a discussion about, could you believe the opposite? Is there a rationale to believe that that thing is not true, right? And how would you conceive of that, and how would you word of that, and then use that as a basis to frame the experiments or the work that you're doing. So it's a good question. I'd have to sort of think about specific hypotheses. I could probably come up with one, but I would look at it from that perspective. I mean, when I say negative hypothesis, what I'm saying is a counter hypothesis, not necessarily one that's worded negatively, right? Like you don't say, we don't believe X. That's not what I'm talking about.
Excellent, thank you. If anyone else has any additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll read them out. I did have a question which you actually answered and stole my thunder, which was about the worst mistake that you'd made, down to a cognitive bias. But I'm also curious whether there's been any situations in your career where you've tried to maybe use cognitive biases in your favor, i.e. to try and play on someone else's cognitive biases to not necessarily get what you want, because that in itself would be a cognitive bias, but maybe to try and steer a conversation in the way that you think it should go, to have the discussion you think should be had, rather than being dragged along another path.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the shorter answer is that's called sales, and it's absolutely done. I'm sure I've done it many times. I'm trying to think of one example where. So I'll give this example, and I have to kind of anonymize it somewhat. I was on a call with a very large customer, and they had outsourced all of their work with our product to. They had a big outsourcing contract with a systems integrator, and the work that our product was doing was outsourced, and the systems integrator really wasn't interested in using productivity tools. They wanted to, I guess, billable hours was their goal. Make a long story short, I had to come up with a scenario where they couldn't say no to using our product. And it was a meeting like no other I ever had, because I actually flew out to the customer a couple weeks later to have the meeting, but it was like interrogating a hostile witness. So here's, there was myself and the sales rep and a couple other people from our company. There was the customer, but then there was the SI, and the SI was really like putting up every argument to not say yes to the product. And I don't remember what the whole path of the conversation was, but in the end, I had to make the case not for the SI, but I had to make the case for the customer so they could tell the SI. And it was the weirdest thing because the customer said nothing at all in the meeting. And I don't know if they're contractually not allowed to say it. In the end, I got the customer to admit through kind of a very logical set of questions, and I had to figure it out that yes, we could save the customer X amount of dollars in the context of their project, and it was a case of, in a way, it was like using confirmation bias against them. Like, they're there to help the customer. The work has been outsourced to them. They can't say no. We don't want to save money, but they have to, kind of put their argument forward. And once I got him to say yes, we could actually save the money. I saw the customer smile, look at the system integrator, didn't really say anything, and then I knew my job was done. But it was really just this sort of, hey, how do I get this weird dynamic and apply some logic and some pressure on them? So I don't know if that was explicitly using a cognitive bias, but I knew I had to get them to say yes. That's all I knew. So.
As you say, very, very much in the sales ballpark there.
100%.
Andrew, have you got any questions for Saeed? We've not got any more coming in the chat so far.
Not questions, just observations, and I'm very thankful that this was such a timely thing to happen, because I'm doing a lot of user interviews right now, and I am trying very, very, very hard to not want to give my opinion on things, and I just have to just sit back and go, oh, and why? Could you tell me a little bit more about this? Or how did that make you feel? So I really have to, ask the what and the whys and the hows, and not so much go ahead and give my opinion, because then I'm adding bias to the conversation. And some of these interviews just start off with, cool, I'm just going to ask you some questions and not give any background as to why I'm asking these questions, because that'll just set them into that tone of, cool, so you're asking me questions about this subject. Now I want to tell you, right? And they start forming their answers before I've even asked the question. So I'm trying very, very hard to not want to jump in and have a discussion. And instead, I just say, well, I would love to have a discussion about this, but this is an interview. So I'm just going to ask my questions. And then, later on, we can always have that discussion, but it's not going to factor into, the interview that I'm running at this time. Yeah, I really appreciate this this conversation happening right now. But I also really felt, I don't know if you've gone through this, I'm sure you have, Jason, the IKEA effect. And when particularly when you're in software, just saying, oh, we'll just build a solution ourselves because we know exactly what we want. But the amount of time that you spend then building that solution, like, did you just build a product? And can you even then productize that and turn that into a product in and of itself?
I once was in a situation where we were evaluating a small company to acquire. And it was they had a really good technical product, and in the end, for whatever reason, we didn't do the acquisition. But one of the arguments that was made by the engineering team was, we can build this in 6 months. There's no, there's nothing valuable here. And I was kind of like, well, why haven't we done it already? Because it was something that customers had requested, and this company had kind of heard it. And, it was like 3 guys, basically. 6 years later, the company introduced a similar product that they built themselves. So, that it's, the Mythical Man Month. Well, there's that mythical, 6-month product. Like I've never seen a build scenario really work well when the buy could have actually been made. So it's interesting. One thing I'll say is that, on your point, Andrea, I think what you described is a really difficult thing to do, to stay so neutral, right? Neutral in your interaction, neutral in your questions. I'm not as good as I could be there, but I think there's nothing wrong with asking certain questions that may have bias in them, as long as you're conscious of it. So, we talked about this, and we know that we shouldn't take too much, or we shouldn't overemphasize certain data because we know that we went down a certain path that, may have led the person or something. To me, it's a fine line. I'm there to try and get insights, and if I can't get them through the standard questions, I'll try other means. But yeah, it's. I think the issue with all of these is that we can't avoid them, but we should recognize them. And if we recognize them, then we can address them as needed. Whether in the data or the impacts in our decisions.
Absolutely. I remember I did a usability test with a lot of people, C. Todd Lombardo, the product research guy, right? And I wanted to actually get him to a very specific point, and it was biased, but there was a reason for it. And he called me out in it mid-interview, and he's like, "Wait a minute, that's a guided question. Like, you're doing this on purpose." And I'm like, "Yes, but there's a reason. Like, yes. There is an output. There's an outcome to this. There's an output to this." So he called me out, but I was like, yes, there's a reason for this, because I'm trying to understand if I'm being biased by asking this question or in this particular situation. So you definitely make a point that as long as you're aware of the fact that the question is biased, it's important.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, so in discovery, you have more control, right? You're in control, and you can be conscious of these biases, and you can work to remove them or mitigate them as much as you can. I think in things where you're working in groups, in decision making, I talked about the road mapping or strategy example. I think those are the ones where it's more challenging, and it really takes a change in culture to really remove that. I've been in more than one executive meeting where it was really clear coming into the meeting, a certain executive had a certain agenda, and there was nothing I could say to change that. Like, the decision was probably made before the meeting even started. And you just have to be aware of that, and then, deal with it when you can. I have a story I like to tell. So managing up is a big skill in product, and how you manage up really plays a big role in how successful you can be. And there are biases galore in management. And I'm not criticizing anyone, but it's just, you know what I'm talking about. So you all know who Pythagoras was, right? And mathematician, and the right angle triangle, and so on. One of the things about Pythagoras was he was a rationalist. He was philosophically believed everything could be determined and specified, and mathematically all numbers are rational. And if you, from a math perspective, a rational number is a number that can be represented as an integer of two fractions, or a fraction of two integers, sorry, or it's a number that does not have a non-repeating pattern. So like pi is an irrational number, but 1.333333 is rational. To make a long story short, one of his students came to him and said, "Hey, if you take a right angle triangle, it's side 1 and side 1. The hypotenuse is √2, and √2 is irrational." And this blew Pythagoras' mind, because the student was using Pythagorean theorem to disprove something that Pythagoras believed. And so what do you think Pythagoras did with that? Like this kind of disruption in this thinking?
I think he probably ignored it or didn't believe it.
Yeah, he wasn't too happy with it, because this was a foundational change in his belief. And so he basically had the student taken out to sea and drowned. That
escalated very quickly, didn't it?
Well, so I use that as an example of how not to manage up, but also in the sense that when you think of cognitive biases and decision making, and sort of these like fallacies, like there's a sunk cost fallacy, like maybe that came into play. Like I bet my whole life on rational numbers. Like I can't change now. But these are the kinds of things you have to be aware of, that decision making is not rational, and it really, has an impact on so many things. Hopefully, no other product manager was subjected to that kind of punishment. But it's, as far as I can tell, it's a true story, because I've read it in multiple sources, and other people have confirmed it that they've also read it. So, but yeah, it's just the most extreme story of how not to kind of make arguments to people who are in power.
That's a great story. I may have to borrow it.
Yeah.
We are almost at the top of the hour.
Yes.
So we're just going to do a quick check and make sure that nobody else has any questions. I do see a few people watching. I think they're being a little bit shy, or they're listening in the background with whatever they're doing. So now is your chance if you do have any questions. If not, of course, you can always tweet directly at the Product Dynamic or at Saeed. And if you drop it our way, we'll definitely pass on the questions. If not, drum roll.
I'll get the sticks up.
I think people are just shy. We may have to wrap it up then.
Let's do it.
In that case, Saeed, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your time. Nice to see you, Jason. And we will be back next month with another presentation. We will definitely be announcing that over the next few weeks on LinkedIn and on our Twitter. So see you again very soon.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.